Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah, amma ba'd. We began reading from chapter 1 about Isaac and Ishmael, the sons of Abraham in the Bible. We'll continue reading where we left off on page 26. Maghrib here, local time, should be in around half an hour, so I'll stop reading then, inshallah. The age of Ishmael, when he was cast into the desert. There is a story in Genesis where Ishmael is portrayed as a bully to his younger brother Isaac as a consequence. And as a consequence, Ishmael and his mother Hagar are cast out of Abraham's household into the desert. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bowshot away, for there she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. Notice the last verse, which mentions that the boy grew up in the desert. This points to Ishmael being a small child when he was initially sent into the desert with his mother Hagar. Also notice that when setting out for the desert, Hagar was made to carry the supplies of food and water, not Ishmael. This implies that Ishmael was too young to carry anything. Also note that while in the desert, Hagar put Ishmael under a bush, again implying that he was young. Note, too, that even though it was Ishmael who was crying, God consoled Hagar, not Ishmael, which implies that he was too young to converse with. Finally, consider that Hagar was told by God to lift up Ishmael. One would not expect a woman, suffering from the fatigue of a harsh desert environment, to be able to lift up Ishmael unless he was very young. We can see that the profile of Ishmael in this story is that of a young child, possibly a baby. There are versions of the Old Testament which make it even more explicit that Ishmael was a young child. The Septuagint version of the Old Testament has the following for Genesis 21, verse 14. And Abraham rose up in the morning and took loaves and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. And he put the child on her shoulder, and he sent her away. And she, having departed, wandered in the wilderness near the well of the oath. The only way that Hagar would have been able to go into the desert carrying Ishmael on her shoulder is if he was very small. So the Septuagint is even more explicit in conveying that Ishmael was a young child when they were cast out. This understanding is echoed by commentators on the Old Testament. The Jewish commentator Rashi wrote, He, Abraham, placed the child Ishmael upon her shoulder. Now a big problem arises if you calculate the age of Ishmael when he was cast into the desert. According to Genesis 16:16, Abraham was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. And according to Genesis 21, verse 5, Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. It follows that Ishmael was already around 13 or 14 years old when his younger brother Isaac was already born. According to Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 to 10, the desert incident took place after Isaac was weaned. The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had bore to Abraham was mocking, and she said to him, Get rid of that slave woman and her son. Isaac would have been weaned for around 3 years, as this is the biblical age of weaning mentioned in 2 Chronicles chapter 31 verse 16 and 2 Maccabees chapter 7 verse 27. So this adds a few more years onto Ishmael's age before he was cast into the desert. Thus, it follows that when Hagar and Ishmael were sent away, Ishmael was a fully grown teenager, around 16 years old. The problem is that the profile of Ishmael in Genesis 21 verses 14 to 19 is a small child and not a fully grown teenager. First, remember that it is Hagar that carried all the supplies into the desert. See Genesis 21 verse 14. If Ishmael were a teenager, then surely Abraham would have made him carry at least some of the supplies to lessen the burden on his mother. Then, secondly, she put the boy under the bush. Genesis 21 verse 15. Now the original Hebrew used is the word shalak, which means to throw, cast, hurl, fling, according to Strong's Hebrew lexicon. One does not throw, cast, hurl, or fling a teenager, especially when one is suffering from the fatigue of a harsh desert environment. The biblical commentary, the International Critical Commentary, supports this view as it describes Ishmael as a boy being carried by Hagar. She cast the boy, whom therefore she must have been carrying, under one of the bushes for protection from the sun. Even though it was Ishmael that was crying, God consoles the mother. Genesis 21 verse 17. This could be taken to imply that Ishmael was too young to converse with. Finally, consider that Hagar is asked to lift up the boy, Genesis 21 verse 18. One would not expect a woman suffering from the fatigue of a harsh desert environment to be able to lift up a fully grown teenager. From all of the evidence, we must conclude that the outcast Ishmael was a helpless infant rather than an able-bodied teenager. One must ask, why does Genesis present Ishmael as an infant who is around 16 years old? Clearly, the account in Genesis 21 is chronologically wrong. The claim that Ishmael mocked Isaac and that this had anything to do with Hagar's exile is an obvious fabrication, since Isaac was not even born yet when this story occurred, as Ishmael was a young child. The Interpreter's Bible compares the text of Genesis 21 verses 14 to 19 with Genesis 16 verses 1 to 16 and concludes that they are sufficiently different to be inconsistent. The inclusion in Genesis of both stories, so nearly alike and yet so sufficiently different to be inconsistent, is one of the many instances of the reluctance of the compilers to sacrifice any of the traditions which has become established in Israel. End quote. Likewise, Professor of Hebrew Bible Larry L. Like, after analyzing attempts by rabbis to harmonize the chronological issues, concludes, in summary, one must conclude that Genesis 21 verse 14 assumes that Ishmael was an infant who was placed on his mother's back when Abraham sent them off into the wilderness of Beersheba, despite the rabbis' attempts to harmonize Ishmael's age and chaps. 21 and 17, it is clear that there is a chronological disparity. End quote. Contrast this problematic account of the desert incident with the Islamic version of the story narrated by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Contrast this problematic account of the desert incident below. I'm going to read it. Abraham brought her, Hagar, and her son Ishmael, while she was suckling him, to a place near the Kaaba, under a tree, on the spot of Zamzam, at the highest place in the mosque. During those days, there was nobody in Mecca, nor is there any water. So he made them sit over there, and placed near them a leather bag containing some dates, and a small water skin containing some water, and set out homeward. Ishmael's mother followed them, saying, O Abraham, where are you going, leaving us in this valley, where there is no person whose company we may enjoy, nor is there anything to enjoy? She repeated that to him many times, but he did not look back to her. Then she asked him, "Has God ordered you to do so?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Then he will not neglect us." End quote. Not only does the Islamic tradition have the correct age of Ishmael, he was a baby, but it also tells us that the reason for them being sent into the desert was a test by God. This is similar to when Abraham was tested by God with the command to sacrifice his son. There is no mention of Ishmael's mockery of an unborn Isaac. Clearly, the biblical account is chronologically flawed and self-contradictory, whereas the Islamic tradition is consistent. Finally, it's worth noting that the Book of Jubilees gives an interesting account of why Ishmael and his mother were cast into the desert. According to Jubilees, Ishmael's banishment is not down to any wrongdoing on his part, but rather the jealous whims of Isaac's mother, Sarah. And Sarah saw Ishmael playing and dancing, and Abraham rejoicing with great joy. And she became jealous of Ishmael, and said to Abraham, "Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman will not be heir with my son, Isaac." Tarnishing the reputation of Ishmael. The following biblical passage is commonly cited when it comes to undermining Ishmael. "He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility towards all his brothers." Genesis 16, verse 12. This passage is often interpreted in a derogatory fashion and used as evidence that Ishmael was a hostile and aggressive person, and thus, unlike Isaac, an unworthy heir of Abraham. This understanding is actually incorrect. The mention here of Ishmael being a wild donkey is by no means a negative portrayal. While in many present-day cultures being described as a wild donkey has negative connotations, in the context of the Bible, it could be a positive description. This is because in the ancient world, wild donkeys were valued and admired animals, in contrast with the domesticated donkey, which is tied up and has to do what its master commands. The wild donkey roams about freely. Remember that his mother, Hagar, was a slave when she was given to Abraham. So the wild donkey imagery could be symbolic of Ishmael, who, God said, would be a free man. The Old Testament scholar Shimon bar Ephrat made a similar comparison. This is usually taken to mean a wild man, but the angel, whose object was to comfort and encourage Hagar, clearly meant something different, namely that the son would be a free man, independent, like the nomadic tribes of the desert, not a slave like his mother. As the Old Testament scholar Gordon Wenham also wrote, this verse describes Ishmael's future destiny, to enjoy a free-roaming, Bedouin-like existence. The freedom his mother sought will be his one day. Likewise, the biblical scholar Nahum Sarna wrote, "Like the wild ass among the beasts, so are the Ishmaelites among men. And their nature and destiny they call to mind the sturdy, fearless, and fleet-footed Syrian onager, Hebrew Peri, I don't know how to say that, who inhabits the wilderness and is almost impossible to domesticate." The book of Job describes some of these traits in the wild donkey. It is strong-willed, choosing its own way. Its habitat is the desert, and it has a nomadic lifestyle. This is seen in Job 39, verse 8, 39, verse 5, and Job 24, verse 5. These characteristics perfectly describe the nomadic lifestyle of Ishmael and his descendants, which they would lead in the desert. In fact, animal imagery is used throughout the Bible. In Genesis 49, Jacob described some of the tribes of Israel as animals. Judah was called a lion's cub, Issachar a sturdy donkey, Dan a serpent, Gad a rampant lion, and Benjamin a wolf. It's important to highlight the fact that Ishmael's name was personally chosen by God before he was even born. Rabbinic tradition says that the act of God naming a person before their birth is an indication of righteousness. 4 were named before they were born: Isaac, Ishmael, Josiah, and Solomon. Isaac, and you shall call him Isaac, Genesis 17, verse 19. Ishmael, and you shall call his name Ishmael, Genesis 16, verse 11. Josiah, behold, a son is to be born in the house of David, 1 Kings 13, verse 2. Solomon, Solomon shall be his name, 1 Chronicles 22, verse 9. This is the case regarding the righteous people. End quote. So, Ishmael was in good company along with other righteous individuals like Isaac, Josiah, and Solomon. Another problem with interpreting wild donkey in a derogatory sense is that it does not fit the context of the chapter of Genesis. In the verses that precede it, we are told that a pregnant Hagar ran away because Sarah mistreated her. God sends an angel to Hagar to give her the good news of the birth of Ishmael. The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery." Genesis 16, verse 11. Note that we are told the reason for Hagar receiving God's news of Ishmael was to comfort her. This is completely at odds with the claim that Ishmael, being a wild donkey, is a negative portrayal. If wild donkey is derogatory, then such news would be a curse rather than a blessing, which would do little to comfort a miserable Hagar. Note Hagar's reaction to this divine promise. She immediately exalts God, which reinforces the notion that the promise represented a blessing for Ishmael. She gave this name to the Lord, who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." Genesis 16, verse 13. It's interesting to note that the Hebrew word used to describe Ishmael as a wild donkey, peri, is actually quite ambiguous. Hebrew scholars have noted that it is very similar to another Hebrew word, para, meaning fruitful vine. This ambiguity is reflected in the different translations of the Hebrew word para and the story of Joseph in Genesis 49, verse 22. While many translations of the Bible describe Joseph as a fruitful vine, others, such as the Jewish Publication Society, describe Joseph as a wild donkey. Joseph is a wild donkey by a spring, wild colts on a hillside. So, what is the correct translation for Ishmael? There is, in fact, evidence that the correct translation for Ishmael is fruitful. It turns out that the same promise by the angel is repeated again later in Genesis 17, and in this chapter it is the Hebrew word para, fruitful, that is used. "And as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation." Genesis 17, verse 20. The word fruitful is very much appropriate for Genesis 16, verse 12, given the context of the chapter. It doesn't stand at odds with the surrounding verses. The angel had just promised Hagar an innumerable number of descendants, so it would be very appropriate to describe Ishmael as a fruitful man. Let's move on to the next part of Genesis 16, verse 12, which makes the claim about Ishmael that his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. The word which is translated against, his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, is a single consonant in Hebrew. Langenschetz dictionary says the following concerning the meaning of this word: in, at, to, on, among, with, towards, according to, by, because of. It is the context of the verse which determines how we should translate the word. However, there is absolutely nothing in the context of Genesis 16, verse 12, that would indicate it must be translated as against. The verse could just as equally be translated as, "His hand shall be with everyone, and every man's hand shall be with him." It just so happens that this exact reading can be found in another version of the Old Testament, the Samaritan Torah. "He will be fertile of man. His hand will be with everyone, and everyone's hand will be with him. And he will live among all his brothers." In conclusion, we can see that any negative interpretation of Genesis 16, verse 12, comes down to prejudices against Ishmael. As professor of religious studies, Rabbi Nancy Fuchs Kramer notes, through the ages, Jewish interpretation of Ishmael have largely depended on the social context of the authors. In the early centuries, rabbis portrayed Ishmael in a variety of ways: negative, positive, and neutral. After the rise of Islam, the author's anxieties and fears were reflected in their consistently negative portrayals of Ishmael. End quote. Let me check the time, see how much time we have. We've got 16 more minutes. Let's keep going. Common misconceptions about Ishmael. Perhaps the most common misconceptions among Jews and Christians is the idea that Ishmael was not included in God's covenant on account of his mother Hagar being a slave woman. Therefore, Ishmael had an inferior status compared to Isaac. This understanding is demonstrably false from a number of different angles. Firstly, the Bible itself bears witness to the fact that Ishmael was Abraham's legitimate son. On that very day, Abraham took his son Ishmael and all those born in his household, or bought with his money, every male in his household, and circumcised them, as God told him. Genesis 17, verse 23. The Bible further informs us that Ishmael remained the legitimate son of Abraham until even after Abraham's death. Then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years. And he was gathered to his people. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, near Mamre, in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite. Genesis 25, verses 8 to 9. Now, when it comes to Ishmael's mother Hagar, it is true that she was a slave woman, but this has no bearing on her status as Abraham's legitimate wife. So after Abraham, had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. Genesis 16, verse 3. According to the Bible, it was Sarah herself, the mother of Isaac and Abraham's first wife, who suggested that Abraham take the slave Hagar as his second wife. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai took his wife to her Egyptian slave Hagar, and gave her to her husband to be his wife. Genesis 16, verses 1 to 3. In the ancient world, it was a matter of utmost importance for a man to have children in order to perpetuate his lineage. This is one reason why it was seen as shameful if a woman was barren and could not bear her husband children. See Judges chapter 13, Psalm 113, verse 9, Isaiah 54, verse 1, Luke chapter 1, verse 7, and verse 25. Therefore, Sarah's encouragement for Abraham to take Hagar as his wife was not only socially acceptable, but even expected according to the customs and norms of the ancient world. There are numerous inscriptions which reveal that such practices were commonplace within marriages. For example, the Code of Hammurabi is an ancient Babylonian code of law which includes regulations relating to marriage. It states, when a seigneur married a Herodial and she gave a female slave to her husband, and she has then borne children, if that later female slave has claimed equality with her mistress because she bore children, her mistress may not sell her. She may mark her with the slave mark and count her among the slaves. Nuzi texts are ancient Mesopotamian documents which mention adoption rituals. If Gilimninu, the bride, bears children, Shenima, the bridegroom, shall not take another wife. But if Gilimninu fails to bear children, Gilimninu shall get for Shinima a woman from the Lulu country as a wife for Shinima. In that case, Gilimninu herself shall have authority over the offspring. An ancient Assyrian marriage contract stipulates Lakipum took in marriage Hatala, the daughter of Ensiru. In the country, Lakipum shall not take in marriage another woman, but in the city he may take in marriage a priestess. If within 2 years she has not procured offspring for him, only she may buy a maidservant, and even later on, after she procures somehow an infant for him, she may sell her wherever she pleases. These inscriptions reveal that it was a social norm within the ancient world for a barren woman to provide her husband with a surrogate wife in order to secure children. Even some of the tribes of Israel were the product of this type of relationship. Genesis 29 describes Bilhah as a handmaid who was given to Rachel, the wife of Jacob. When Rachel failed to have children, Rachel gave Bilhah to Jacob to bear him children. Bilhah gave birth to 2 sons, who Rachel claimed as her own and named Dan and Naphtali. So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife. Jacob slept with her, and she became pregnant and bore him a son. Then Rachel said, God has vindicated me. He has listened to my plea and given me a son. Because of this, she named him Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, I have had a great struggle with my sister, and I have won. So she named him Naphtali. Genesis 30, verses 4 to 8. Dan and Naphtali were in fact 2 of the tribes of Israel, so the status of their mother Bilhah, who Genesis 35, verses 22, expressly calls a concubine, obviously had no bearing on their legitimacy, in the same way that Ishmael's mother Hagar has no negative bearing on his own status as Abraham's legitimate son. Now, if one wants to insist on questioning Abraham's relationship with Hagar by applying modern standards of morality to what was a norm in the ancient world, then it also brings Abraham's relationship with Sarah into disrepute. Besides, she is really my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife. Genesis 20, verse 12. Here Abraham explains that Sarah was his half-sister through their father, a relationship that would be considered incestuous by modern standards. The Talmud takes a different view of Sarah. It states that she was Abraham's niece, but again, this relationship would also be considered incestuous by modern standards. One final point is that it was God's decision to close Sarah's womb, as stated by Sarah herself. The Lord has kept me from having children. Genesis 16, verse 2. This action by God resulted in Abraham taking Hagar as his wife, and subsequently led to the birth of Ishmael. We can see that God, in his sovereignty, planned for the birth of Ishmael, just as he planned the supernatural birth of Isaac. In summary, the Bible confirms that Hagar was Abraham's legitimate wife. Being a prophet of God, Abraham would have known best whether it was an acceptable relationship in the eyes of God. Were Ishmael an illegitimate child, as some wrongfully conclude, then that would imply that Abraham had an illegitimate relationship with Hagar, an act of adultery, a serious accusation indeed. From the evidence, it is clear that Abraham undoubtedly had a legitimate relationship with Hagar, and so Ishmael was a legitimate son, just as Isaac was. Another misconception about Ishmael relates to geography. It is commonly believed that Isaac had exclusive access to all of the land that God promised Abraham's descendants. Let's look at that promise. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace, and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, and said, To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. Genesis 15, verses 13 to 17. There are two parts to this promise. The first part mentions that Abraham's descendants would become slaves in a foreign land. God would free them from their oppressors, and they would go on to reclaim the land of the Amorites. That this is a prophecy that was fulfilled by the exodus of Moses and the Israelites from Egypt is not disputed. It is the second part of the promise that is controversial. God prophesies that Abraham's descendants would be granted land stretching from the Nile River in Egypt in the west to the Euphrates River in the east. We have two candidates for whom this prophecy could be fulfilled: the descendants of Isaac or the descendants of Ishmael. Many Jews and Christians believe that it is Isaac's descendants, the Israelites, who would fulfill this prophecy. The first problem with this understanding is that the Old Testament tells us that while Moses and the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness, God informed them that they would not possess a number of the lands that lie between the Nile and Euphrates. Then the Lord said to me, "You have made your way around this hill country long enough. Now turn north. Give the people these orders. You are about to pass through the territory of your relatives, the descendants of Esau, who live in Seir. They will be afraid of you, but be very careful. Do not provoke them to war, for I will not give you any of their land, not even enough to put your foot on. I have given Esau the hill country of Seir as his own." Then the Lord said to me, "Do not harass the Moabites or provoke them to war, for I will not give you any part of their land. I have given Ar to the descendants of Lot as a possession." Deuteronomy 2, verses 2 to 9. The second problem with this understanding is that the Old Testament explicitly states that all of God's land promises to Israel were fulfilled during the time of Joshua. So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and had settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled. Joshua 21, verses 43 to 45. The book of Joshua goes into great detail listing the lands of Canaan that Isaac's descendants, the Israelites, occupied under the leadership of Joshua. Here, God declares that he has fulfilled his promises. He has fulfilled his promise to the Israelites. They had been granted all the land he promised their forefather Abraham. But the lands of Canaan, which they occupied, only accounted for a small subset of the land promised to Abraham's descendants, which God declared would stretch all the way from the Nile River to the Euphrates River. Jews and Christians might argue that the book of Exodus explicitly associates both Isaac and Jacob with all the land that God promised to Abraham in the following passage: "And I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as possession. I am the Lord." Exodus 6, verse 8. The problem with this particular reading, which has been taken from the Masoretic text version of the Old Testament, is that the mention of Isaac and Jacob is a later addition. The earliest reading can be found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which has no mention of Isaac and Jacob. "I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, and I will give it to you for a heritage." Historically, in the thousands of years that have passed since God spoke this prophecy to Abraham, the Israelites have never occupied such territory. It is Ishmael's descendants, the Arabs, who fulfilled this promise by God. It was achieved through the prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, whose companions and successors rapidly spread east and west, conquering not just the promised land foretold by God, but much of the world. In fact, at the time, the Islamic Empire was the largest the world had ever seen. This is a fulfillment of God's promise in the Quran. God has promised those who have believed among you and done righteous deeds that he will surely grant them succession to authority upon the earth, just as he granted it to those before them, and that he will surely establish for them therein their religion, which he has preferred for them, and that he will surely substitute for them, after their fear, security. For they worship me, not associating anything with me. Surah 24, verse 55. I'm going to leave it there because it's almost prayer time. We'll pick it up on page 38. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for stopping by. Can't pronounce that name. It starts with a W. I see the other person with an M as well. Thanks for watching.